And welcome back to Lead-Based Studios. This is Nick Fights. Currently showing a screen cap right now of a drawing reference we'll get to later. But today I'm going to be talking about drawing references using action figures using your own phone, a couple of tips and tricks regarding how to draw Spider-Man, and then maybe my own personal sketch of Lion-O, given a lot of the hubbub boiling over right now with the outbreak that is Thundercats Roar. So what's going on? Welcome back to it. That's the reference pose that we're going to be using today for a little demo video. And right now I'm going to go over a couple of little pointers regarding how to use action figures for coming up with references and so on. So a little bit of tips and tricks for action figure choices. How do you pick the right action figure? Why not just use people? Well, the biggest problem with using people is who do you have around you as a pool to draw from of talent? Like, what kind of talent pool do you really have at your disposal? A majority of the time, you're probably going to have a few friends, maybe friends who are also nerds like ourselves who like the form of entertainment, but that doesn't always mean they have the trained eye to be able to see the subtleties that make what they like succeed. You know, they tend to take it right at surface value and just accept it as, well, you know, that's good. And so they might see, well, this character has guns, this character has tanks, and so on. And maybe that's what makes it good. So we'll start to look a little bit deeper as to why action figures work better as opposed to just relying on someone else to stand there and pose, because you get into the interpersonal issues of if you really want a good camera angle, it might be kind of creepy depending on where you put the camera with a person, and they may not feel comfortable as a model. So we'll get to that. But for starters, how do you pick the right action figure? How do you pick the right visual reference? I mean, this even comes into, well, even human talent. You could still apply this to human talent, because the problems you could still run into can consist of issues like Gog over here. You could pick this character from Kingdom Come, and you could say, look at the muscle sculpt on him, look at the way the lighting falls on the muscles. You could say there's a lot there. I mean, look at his pose. It's a very powerful pose. But then the problem you run into for trying to use this as a reference action figure is actual mobility. It's not very versatile. I mean, his arm can go up, his arm can go down, and any manner of variation between the two. And even for the sake of back reference, sure, there's a lot of good sculpted back muscles there. See if you can see it in the lighting. But yet that back muscle doesn't move. It doesn't exactly flex. So the other part of his problem is you have a good portion of his shoulder covered up by costume. So this arm has even less mobility, and then a good portion of him is covered up by costume. Now his legs aren't exactly that defined with muscle. He has costume covering them up, so you don't get much muscle definition out of them. You know what, I'm actually going to switch to my Let's Draw camera so I can put him underneath this camera here. Here we go. So look at his legs. He's got a lot of good costume, but you can't see any muscle definition. It's just sort of a bulging football shape in the area of his quad. In his calf muscles, there's definitely no definition, not even the backside. It's just sort of a swollen cone shape with some vinyl siding going down the front part of him. Now, this isn't a slant to the design of the characters. I really love Kingdom Come. It's a great story, and I understood the reference of the sort of golden calf that everyone came to idolize, as opposed to the true, genuine, altruistic heroes. But as an action figure, this looks great, but for a drawing reference, it's unfortunately not that good, because it doesn't provide much mobility. And I've got this classic Batman figurine here from the 90s. I've had him forever and a day. Now, he has a bit more mobility. He has good sculpt. You can still see a lot of definition, back muscles, arm muscles, leg muscles even. See good definition. You see the way the lighting hits across the surface of it. But then it still comes down to mobility. So if I'm going to switch back, get to this camera here, so you can see an overall pose. Okay, we got a good T pose. He can rotate his arms, lift a leg. He might be able to get some good lunging and leaping poses, but you can tell it's still very robotic. There is no side-to-side flex to the character. There's not really much you can work with for the sake of dynamic. But if you're going for, let's say, a drop-in Batman pose, this does kind of work fairly well. You can get the right camera angle to support it, and this goes in what I was going to talk about. Now, based on how far away he is from the camera, you can see the difference between his foot and his head Not that much difference, but it's the foot's a little bit larger. So we get the idea that perspective is in play. Now if I was to bring that in closer to the camera, the size difference between his foot and his head definitely change. So now we have a much more dynamic force perspective. So with that force perspective, whether we're doing like a jump leap and his fist is coming at you, something like this, the closer that fist comes to the camera, the larger it becomes, more so than his own head. And that's force perspective. You can see all the way back here, his foot gets much smaller as the fist is aimed at the camera. Now that's how you start getting into using a camera angle with your own phone, with a webcam or something, to really capture that very dynamic panel that you might want to use the pose for. But unfortunately, we're still looking at a very limited mobility regardless of the muscular reference. Now, secondly, or sorry, this is probably third, another bad example would be proportion related. So for instance, I've got Savage Dragon here. And again, another great back muscle reference, arm muscle reference, maybe even neck muscles. You can see all the veins and stuff and the different muscle buildup under the neck there. Great sculpt. Unfortunately, when it comes to an overall pose and proportion, he has what bodybuilders would nickname the prison build. And you could probably bench press 400, 450 or something with the size of those pectorals and biceps and deltoid. But he probably can't really squat over 200. Maybe if he can even squat that. There's a little bit of calf muscle bulge in the back of his jeans there, but not much definition to actually draw on. So not really like a good nude sculpt, obviously, because he's wearing pants. But you get more of like a nude sculpt with the back. But the biggest problem being proportion. His hands are far outscaling the size of his own feet. His upper body build compared to his lower body build. Now again, not a slant to the design of the character. This is with intent. This is the style that Erik Larsen created when he created Savage Dragon. And that's perfectly fine. It looks good. Now this is excellent reference if you're going to draw Savage Dragon, because it does still have a lot of mobility. And he can move his legs out to the side. I mean, this line of action figures I really appreciate because you even have the toe that can bend. So you can put that much more energy in it. And I forget the Renaissance term for it. But there is a Renaissance term when it comes to emoting through the character, and it's used through Michelangelo's David. It refers to all the way down to the pinky toe. It's saying whatever the character is emoting, you should show it throughout the entire form all the way down to the pinky toe. It's basically advocating that every part of the body is important. So whether the character's being punched and they're being knocked back or something, every aspect of their pose should illustrate that. And so using an action figure does give you that kind of micromanaging control where you can illustrate the pain in every single aspect. And again, these are such great sculpts, you can even move the thumb. There's articulation in each individual finger. So I could really give him like a cranked out, like ridiculous reaction. I can even use these hands for drawing reference if I sculpt this right. If I pose that just so. That almost looks like a kind of he's reaching out to clutch after something. Let me switch again back to this camera so you can see this up close. So I could use this for really good hand reference because the hands are so large. There's wrist articulation, both forward and backwards, and it kind of has a pop to it so it holds in place. It doesn't relax or loosen. There's a wrist articulation side to side inside the forearm. The elbow itself has articulation. It can open up. The bicep as well can actually twist without the deltoid actually moving. So you can change the direction of the lower arm just by twisting the actual upper bicep. And I forget the line of this specific toy. Anyone who knows it can go ahead and comment that on the video and tag it so other people can find them. But this specific line of toys goes all the way down to double jointing the knee. So it actually has like the floating cartilage space like in a regular knee. Even though you don't have the muscular sculpt though, this gives you that kind of posability. So some of the positives and negatives of it. It's not exactly the end-all be-all, but it has its bonuses, it has its benefits. It's just you have to be able to face those realities. And again, this comes back to those who can look at something and say, oh, that's why I like it, and being able to identify why they like it, as opposed to just looking at it and saying, oh, it's a Savage Dragon, he's really sculpted and he can move a lot, yay. So for me, my end-all be-all pose references, and I can use these for any kind of body build. I just sort of just swell up the muscles more if I need to, or even change the gender to a female if I need to. My end-all be-all action figures for poses are Madman and Nightcrawler. Because of all the benefits I just listed there for Savage Dragon, I have the added benefit of proper proportions. So the length of arms to the overall body. I've got the posability where the figure itself is actually fairly rigid in its posture. So it'll tend to hold its pose no matter what I put it in. I can articulate the shoulders. I can even articulate the torso. So I can have him hunch. I can have him arch his back. And this is especially good for my comic book, The Brine, where I have all of my characters underwater and they're all swimming. So I can pose this character as though he's kind of chugging right along through the waterway. Maybe even tilt his head up. Maybe arch his back more. Maybe even arch the legs up behind him, and I create a much more dynamic swooping and diving through the water sort of pose. Maybe I have his hand out, kind of trailing behind. Perhaps even bring up one of the knees while having the other one extend its own toe. So this is very much a good Superman pose. It's a soaring through the air, and this could even be transferred to a Supergirl. And yet again, depending on the camera angle you want to use, the position of him in relation to the eye of the reader, and then the location of the actual camera in relation to him, starts adding more dynamics. You can see how much smaller his feet become in that panel, and how much larger his head becomes just by getting it closer to the camera. It's generating that forced perspective, where the head's much larger, and the feet are pushed further and further to the background. Whereas if I pull it back away from the camera, you can see the proportion to foot to head is almost the same. The foot's almost about the same size as the head. If I can move that out of the way of our background there so you can see. So let's say even his closest hand still looks like it's proper distance from the face, whereas if I change the camera angle, bring it closer, and then just move it right in, you start to see where the hand gets exceptionally larger than the actual face itself. So that's forced perspective, and that's what you're doing with your camera when you're finding these kind of pose references. So I tend to use Nightcrawler and Madman because a lot of the times I'm dealing with two characters at once, and you need two body proportions fairly similar if that's what the two characters are. Other times I will go all the way up to grabbing my Pit character. If you don't know who Pit is, Google search. I use my Pit character for using like a giant orc type creature known as the Greenback, which you can actually see right over here. The Greenback grabbing onto the body of Dugong. So I used the Pit action figure for that kind of scaled reference. I didn't use it directly for the proportions of hands to the arm because Pit is much wider. His hands are massive and he has claws. But I used it for the overall scale differences between the two. Alright, so enough talking, enough theorem. Let's get to actually sketching. So let's go into poses as we were just using a few references. I'm just going to kind of make some up on the fly here. But this would be for warm-ups for how to draw, say, Spider-Man. And I don't know why my image is being burned in there. That's pretty interesting. I don't know, can you guys see that? Some strange glitch. Let's try to hop around. We'll come back to it. Let's see. Will that get burned in there? Looks like it is. That's bizarre. Okay. Well, at least there's a promo burned in and not my face. Alright. So the first thing I tend to do when I start sketching is just light, loose ovals, and I start throwing down where the actual head is. And if I'm doing something like Spider-Man, some of the biggest tips I do with Spider-Man follow along what Todd McFarlane advises, which is you focus less on the man, more on the spider aspect. So there has to be a lot of motion, a lot of kind of creepy, crawly, spindly arms and spindly legs, a lot of, as he refers to, kinked joints, so joints that are bent and flexed in opposing directions. It creates a lot of that hunched up spider feeling, which you could apply to either one of the spider people, whether you have Spidey Gwen, whether you've got Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2099, Iron Spider, Scarlet Spider. You just keep on going. There's plenty of spiders in the arachnid family. So what I start to do is I just do very loose gestures where I'm trying to capture, let's say this here. This is just the top portion of his shoulders. So that cylinder would be going away from you. and then throwing all these different arcing lines in here. I'm trying to figure out whether maybe this is a knee. And so it's experimentation. I'm a mad scientist in a lab right now, just sort of experimenting. Maybe this right here is the other leg. And I'm adding the circles at the end of those body proportions, just so I know where the extent of that limb is. Just the lower leg comes up here and then it ends, so I know that's essentially where the kneecap should extend off of. And the rest of these arcing lines, maybe I've got that leg coming further behind, and maybe I've got this one going further forward. Maybe I've got arms bent and flexed down through the center. Maybe I've got one overreaching. So this is a very classic Spider-Man pose. It's the one hand down. And he's got like all of his weight on the extra webbing here because he's swinging along. So there's this line. And then maybe the other hand's even back. But my advice for drawing Spider-Man is keeping it loose like that and being able to let yourself throw poses away, because some of them, even like this, while he's all bound up, they still lack a lot of motion. It still lacks dynamics because nothing's coming at the camera. So I keep adding to that. I'm going to add to that same idea. I'm going to draw his torso from the top, so he's definitely hunched way over. And add his hip box underneath it so I know where his legs are coming from now. I'm going to maybe bring this leg much more straight on towards the camera. And I'm even going to forget the calf muscle and go right into the foot. I'm going to tell myself how much closer the foot is than the head. So there's that leg just coming straight at us. Huge foot in the foreground. And then with the laws of contrapposto, to keep it balanced, the other leg then goes behind. You can maybe see his foot just dipping underneath there. And that leaves us room to play around with his arms. So we knew before, had his arm kind of trailing down. Maybe this one trails down, say on the outside of that leg, and there's his fist. And these are just the rope kind of loops. Maybe have his webbing go out that direction. And so given that this foot is coming forward, maybe I'll get the other arm coming forward. And so I'm going to completely skip the arm. I'm going to go right into drawing sort of a hand shape. So maybe I've got his fingers coming out this way. There's his thumb. He's got his two fingers balled up. And he's just firing off his webbing that direction. So the key for me for drawing Spider-Man is always in the pose. Whether it's a candid shot, let's say he's on the side of some building somewhere. If this is the side of the building, I'll move my paper up so you can see. There we go. I'm going to capture the arc line of his back. Now I'm thinking of this in profile as though he's just sort of hunched off the side of a building somewhere. Like he's taking a breather, maybe just sort of eating a sandwich, just taking a big old look at New York City. Maybe he's even bored. So again, he's like, oh, why can't things ever go right for me? I mean, that's the typical Spider-Man plight. Nothing ever goes good for Peter Parker, but everyone loves Spider-Man. Maybe his other foot has just a little bit of a change in elevation, so I can change the way his arms are going. Let me just come in there with inks real quick to define that pose a bit more. So here's his arm that's furthest from the camera. Here's his other knee that's back there. Here's the knee that's closest to the camera. Glutes coming up through the back. And then again, emoting. Everything about this pose should be reading as though, you know, Peter Parker is kind of at his wit's end. He's stressed out. So he's kind of sitting almost like the thinker, but his hands are down, as opposed to his hands being up, even resting his head on it. That would read more as someone who's completely lost all hope. Nothing's even holding him up, and he has to hold his own head up. Letting his hands drop and letting his head droop sort of shows even more exasperation, where he doesn't even have the energy to even lift his own head up, and so he's just sort of slumped off the side of some building somewhere, just looking at the city, and maybe he's even got his own mask on. And he's just like, I just can't even today. I just so can't even. So maybe his hair is kind of whipping in the wind. He's got that like hat head, you know. Superheroes pull off their mask in movies and their hair is always perfect, but in real life he'd have like some hat hair going on, some crazy mask head. So those are some tips and tricks for working with Spider-Man. Just keeping it loose and everything. Now when it comes to drawing his actual face, drawing his head in the actual mask, biggest problems people run into is they go straight into drawing the mask. And then it always looks weird. So I'll start off with an oval just as a base lay-in. But even once I start drawing that mask, I do want to actually envision where the face is. And you do have to go through the same process. You may not be drawing the eyeballs in the final version, or the mouth, or the nose, ears, or whatever, but the rest that you will bulk in there will still make it very important to define how the mask looks. For instance, where his cheek line is, like the cheekbones as those are defined, the outside of his jowls for where the edge of his mouth is, maybe the actual size and proportion of his chin, maybe the taper inward of his jawline, and that kind of teenage sculpted jawline that doesn't have any age or wear and tear on it yet. And then the cranium maybe even bulges out just a little bit more to kind of show that youth proportion. And therefore I round off the top of the actual head as opposed to having that long, thin oval. Not to mention where his ears would be, having now drawn it in perspective. So you could bulk those in. That'll kind of thicken up the side of his mask. And now I can define how far up on the top of his actual head his mask will go. Maybe I have it come right down to the actual brow line, so it kind of accentuates like just giant eyebrows. And then this rolls around, let's say right underneath his chin. And I don't want it to be too oval shape, and it'll start looking like Deadpool. Which is kind of the point of Deadpool's mask, is he kind of emulates and idolizes superheroes, and so he's pretending to kind of be one by sort of dressing like Spider-Man. And then I can just darken those in. Now some of the coolest effects I've seen done with Spider-Man's costume aren't even what I've seen in the movies, where he has the risen up spider web and it's like three-dimensional that kind of pops off the surface of his costume. What I tend to like are those who actually render the costume as though it was a very real material. So now I'm going to smooth this out here where his ear was and round that out. And by that, what I mean by rendering it is to treat it as though there actually is a light source, let's say up and across here. So all the webbing you would normally draw on, you would just omit that webbing, just don't actually draw it to there. So you have his webbing going up and over the top of his head, but near the top of his head you'd actually stop the webbing and don't draw it completely. Same goes maybe for the lower portion of the face. Because we drew the face, we know this area might be in shadow. Maybe because the bone structure and the nose, this portion might actually be in shadow. Maybe even this side of his forehead away from the actual light source is in shadow. So me, I like my Spider-Man dynamically lit with a light source, not turned up. So I have to start to add in the webbing. I tongue-tied myself there. And there you can see what I left behind as I drop in the inks here to make this more concrete. And I'm just using a Uniball micro. I wouldn't normally use this when inking my actual pages on the BRINE. But this is very smooth across the surface. There's almost no resistance. I gotta wedge my paper underneath my keyboard now, so now my drawing is kind of towing around my keyboard. And now the eye shapes for Spider-Man, those are also something that are not concrete. And you can play around with those. You can let those flex. You can kind of bring them down narrow, make him look like he's actually angry, so that you're accentuating that white space is his actual eyeball. So you can bring it down to a really fierce squint. You can bring it up to an oh my golly gosh, like wide open paranoid kind of thing. It's what the movies tried matching with the Civil War movie. They realized it's about time. We have the CG, we have the technology to do it. Let's finally make Spider-Man emote. And so they gave him those weird kind of panels on the suit that Tony Stark gave him when he bribed an illegal miner into a combat zone. Overseas, mind you. Overseas. When he lied to his legal parental figure and took him overseas into a live combat zone. That's what your idol Tony Stark did. Face it. So now same thing when I start inking this top too, where the light source is, I'm going to avoid giving him a thick contour line. Same with the spider webbing is going to basically just disappear in that area. The contour liner on the outside should also disappear. Just dropping in my shadows here. Move up my page again. And normally when doing webbing, I tend to like the style where the webbing is kind of chaotic and it's not perfect. But just for drawing's sake, I'm going to keep it balanced here. I think for the first time in a long time, I have a Uniball Micro. It's running out of ink. Yep. Here I am talking them up. Yeah, they're real good. They work so good for drawing. No resistance. Now I can feel myself scratching the surface because it's running dry. Now I've got another one here. There we go. Uniball Micro 2, Electric Boogaloo. I have to legitimately say that every time I hear the word 2, otherwise my kids will believe I'm a cyborg from the future and they will try to kill me. Because it's been such a running joke of mine for so long, I've outright told them, I said that'll be the way you'll know if I'm really daddy or if I'm some sort of clone from the future. If you say blah 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 2, if I don't say Electric Boogaloo, knock me out. Trying to find my correct eraser. I got like 3 erasers. Trying to find the right one. Here we go. So now I get rid of that little oval I drew in representing the highlight on the surface. As I get rid of the pencil lines, you'll start to see how the inking without that area creates that contrast in the highlight. And that tends to be the type of Spider-Man I like, where he's shadowed, he's lit in a way that the costume details kind of disappear. And this gives the colorist room to play as well. I think that if you ink him too perfectly and draw every single line on there, it comes off almost like a coloring book, almost cartoony to the extent, with a contour line on every single webbing. It then starts to make it look like, well, what is there to color? Where's the highlight? So you give them that highlight, you let the lines tend to disappear, so even on the underside of the face, it looks like there's underlighting bouncing up on him, and it definitely looks like a solid light source hitting the top of his cranium. Alright, so let's switch up. Now let's get to what we've all been waiting for, or at least maybe one person has. This is for Cliff. Cliff, let's get to your reference picture right here. Now for this reference picture, what I've got going on here is a couple of different dynamic figures. One more bland, because it doesn't need to be. It's doing the controlling. It can be boring and bland. And one more dynamic. So the background character is definitely the sort of boring and bland pose, because that reads through the personality of the character. If they're more powerful, if they're the puppeteer, if they're kind of controlling, that background character can afford to be sort of dull in their pose, because that reads through as confidence, almost like a faux confidence, a false confidence. Whereas the foreground character is much more dynamic. And where the pose may not have actually intended to be dynamic, I could force it a little bit more so. So as I add these lines here, you can actually start to see the perspective of the body. The body are the kind of orangish red lines. And you see there's a little bit of perspective between the shoulders and the waist. So the body is arched backwards a little bit, creating a distortion. It is angled away from the viewer's eye. And then you look at the upper portion of the arms. The green lines represent that perspective. So leaving from the shoulder joints down and out, you can see how the elbows are coming closer towards the viewer. And then the way the forearms are wrenched upward with the hands, they then change direction and they create perspective going up towards the center again. Helps draw the eye back into the center of the action, which is great. That's perfect. And now the background character, as I reveal their kind of action lines, there's a little bit of personality, kind of a flowing confidence or almost arrogance, almost water-like movement to their body. Very celestial, very elemental, which is perfect for anyone of magical ability. And the arms, extending straight away from the shoulders, are coming directly towards the viewer. Now my own preference, I would probably go without the palms up. Through pantomime and classic acting, with body language, palms up is always more of an offering or an asking. You're either handing something to someone and saying, "Here, have this," or you're taking something. So with the hands up like this, you're waiting to receive, or you are offering something. "Here, have the almighty eraser," or at the same time, "May I please have the eraser?" And it tends to be the head position that confirms that. Your hands and your head act together, and depending on how they change, that changes the message. So if my head is down and my hands are out, there's a bit more passiveness of "I don't deserve to look up and make eye contact." If I am looking out from underneath and making eye contact, it might be more of a deceptive sense of "Here, have this," and someone probably shouldn't actually want to take it. If we go back to that pose reference, you can see how the hands are forward and the head is down. It's a bit more of like, "Here, have this." What I might do personally is change it up to, from that position where the arms are going straight forward, because of the position behind and the strain in the foreground character, I would change the hands down to create almost more of a puppeteering, like a marionette, and the strings are attached to the fingers. I would make that kind of direct reference with the pose. So that would be a subtle change that I would do. So there being the reference, let me go ahead and add in the lines again for the back character. Alright, so because I can only see this when you guys see this, I'm going to go ahead and just lightly sketch in the poses to sort of work from there. And you can tell with the background character there's not much of the body that's visible, because that character is hidden by the head of the foreground character. So the body's not that visible, and I start off with just this light box, following kind of the curvature of this back line that I've already drawn in. And I'm drawing right through the figures. Even though I'm drawing the foreground figure here, I'm drawing right over top of that spine line, because he's going to have his own spine line. So his torso is going to be turned up just a little bit more here, and rotated back. So as the bodies come towards us. And there's one of the reasons why we don't do low angles this strong with certain characters, because it does create this weird trapezoidal shape. So instead I'm going to taper in the waist area and have them arch their back, so that by the time you get to the actual hip box, the hip box is almost in a straight-on perspective with the viewer. But it'll be the upper torso area that's kind of angled away from us. And then to add to the upshot, I'm actually going to lower down that head and let the neck kind of overlap it. So I'm just lightly bulking in all the different muscle groups, especially up into the neck. I'm going to establish the jawline here. And upshots are a pain in the neck. Literally, they're a pain. Doing upshots from characters, you distort the face so much that we see it from an angle we don't normally see it at. And so therefore, no matter how proportionate you try to draw it, it's still always going to look just weird and odd to the viewer's eye. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. If you're going to do an upshot, you really got to spend a lot of time making sure all the elements are in line. So here I'm drawing the underhang, or the overhang if you will, of the brow line. So the bottom side of the nose as it kind of connects up to. So here's this trapezoidal shape for the bottom side of the nose. The forehead lines as they taper up and away from us. As I've demonstrated in a lot of other videos before, I'll do another one coming up soon. The specific structure of the head that I draw, it's derivative from a lot of styles I've seen. Frank Cho sculpt and draw it that way. Adam Hughes tends to sculpt and build the skull that way. And so I'm really not reinventing the wheel or anything. I'm just sort of applying different techniques from different artists all together in one. As well as David Finch. David Finch constructs the brow line, the jaw line, and everything that way too. And now I'm going to bring this kind of underhang, this waddle, as they refer to it in the Ally McBeal show. I'm going to bring that down into the actual throat, and the neck muscles down in. Neck muscles down into the shoulder muscles. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and get into the arms. I'm just going to bulk off of this shoulder socket here where the actual shoulder muscles are, the rounded deltoids. Now his arms are not going to be hanging straight at his side. They're not going to be hanging straight at his side, they're actually coming out towards us. So as I draw this line out, I'm envisioning that the arms are coming towards us a little bit at least. So I'm going to start drawing this a little bit larger and get us a taper coming out and away. So then this general area here is where the elbows are, and his hands are going to be coming up again, still towards us, so there's a little bit more kind of up and out motion. And he had his hands sort of wrenched back towards the center of the composition, so it draws your eye back in. I'm going to start bulking in the forearm muscles, which with the bicep being curled that way, the forearm muscles are also being wrenched up, and so you can get a bit more of that bulbous shape, and then taper it back to the wrists. And unless you're drawing a cyborg character, every line is organic. You'll notice so far I have yet to use a straight edge. So even though we think of bones as straight, in truth they're actually not straight. A lot of our bones have a structure that's curved. And it all comes back to that basic concept. So like even our forearm bones, we've got two of them in there and they're kind of curved. Think of the basic concept of an egg. End to end, the structure of the egg is the strongest. The side to side, because of the oblong shape of it, it's at its weakest. It'll crush that way. So bones function with that same purpose. End to end, they need to be strong for impact, for running, from climbing, from slamming. All of our bones have that kind of curve. And so as I bulk in the muscles, I'm also accentuating the curve without the muscle. And I'm just putting in loose little boxes with some saggy tissue hanging off each side to just accentuate the clenched fists. From here I've already established about where the bottom of his pectoral muscles are, and because we're seeing them from the underside, they wrap around the chest. They wrap around the chest a little bit and then deviate and lift off of the surface. So if you picture this as being connected, this is then disconnected. So this is your overhang, and that's where you end up getting shadow. So this is sort of wrapping around the chest on that side. So I'm curving it up and around, and then it deviates from that and lifts off, and it disappears between the deltoid muscle and the bicep connection. And so your pectoral muscles end up having this like home plate shape from baseball. Just a little bit stretched out and oblong. And that would just be a matter of holding this up to the light or flipping it around and seeing it in reverse to try to be able to find Let's see if you can even see it through the paper. Yeah, you can see it through the paper. There you go. So you can start to see where it's actually not balanced, where it's a little bit off. Those are little tips and tricks a lot of different artists will do to find out where the anatomy is not symmetrical. And so maybe I'll bring this further out here. Maybe I'll cut that side a little bit lower. Maybe bring this side a little bit lower. And then up into it. But nowadays with modern technology too, you don't have to fumble so hard to try to flip it around. Just take a snapshot of it with your phone and use the editing ability to just flip the image. And then keep flipping it back and forth while you're in it, and you'll start to notice as you do that, you'll start to notice when things are oblong or when one side's a little bit larger than the other, and that'll stick out to the eye really fast. Now this first row of ab muscles that I'm starting to drop in here, I tend to treat all in one. It's just like a pair of buck teeth sticking down underneath the ribcage overhang. And much like in this sketch, it's actually stretched out. It's hyperextended. It's really pulled away from the pelvic bone. And because of that, it will actually show up in lighting. Whereas if he's just standing naturally, a well-sculpted set of abs, that top row right here will usually be in shadow because it's being overhung by the actual rib cage. In this case, that's actually not so, because we have his body arched backwards, chest up towards the light source. So we might shade just the bottom of each without going too crazy. Drop in the love handles, which honestly I don't even know the name of those, and drop in the lats, and I'll accentuate the rib cage in front of the lats. And there's this weird dead space between your love handles and your actual leg muscles. There's this weird dead space right here where it's just flat. It's practically exposed bone. Now there's still sinew there and skin and whatnot. But the actual leg muscles, if you were to draw them off of here, they don't actually start at the bottom of your love handles. They start here after this bizarre gap. So I'm just going to throw on just the loose gesture of some leg muscles, giving him an off-screen wide stance. Alright, so then given this pose, the bicep is up on top and it's flexed, so the long, elongated football shape it would normally be ends up becoming more of like a bunched up kind of softball, where near the bottom you start to see a separation in the muscle groups. It still comes up to a point here where it's overlapped by your pectoral, and then the deltoid sticks off through there. But near the bottom, you get almost like this little curvature where there's a separation in the muscle groups. So we may not define it very much because the forearm's in the way, but it does give us room to then define the tricep behind it. And if I've learned anything from listening to Arnold Schwarzenegger talk about lifting, it's that if you want to increase your actual bicep measurement, you need to do tricep work as well, because the triceps flex outward side to side, the bicep flex only one direction forward. So if you actually want to bulk up this mass, you actually have to improve your tricep as well. So that kind of balance allows for a huge bulking bicep here. It's doing that softball effect. Then that tricep bulges out behind it and elongates down to the elbow. So now, focusing back on the background character, because this character's kind of laid in well enough, at this point I could begin throwing garb on him. Let's say he's like the Samson type of robe or something. Maybe he's even got bracers. Maybe it's like an old Hercules type of movie. Or maybe he's even breaking chains, so there's lines for the chains popping over him, and I could just spend all kinds of time just drawing in links. But I'm not going to bother doing that. Anyway, to the background character. Now, very similar to the biceps, the upper arms that left this character, these ones are coming straight at us, so I'm not even going to bother drawing the length of them. I'm just going to keep drawing the circumference of them, or the cross-section. I'm going to keep drawing them as they come closer, as I'm mentally scaling up in my mind what portion it was, and then out here becomes the wrists. So this is the forearm now bulked up. There's a little bit of bicep flexing to the inside here, deltoids across the top. and I'll do my puppeteer hands coming down off the wrists. Again, if I jump back to the reference, the hands are more palms up and fingers down. I still like that gesture because it draws the eye down into the character, but I'm going to change that up so you're seeing the top part of the hands. That'll allow me to kink up a finger or two and really do that sort of Bela Lugosi vampire thing where he's Bick, where he's just kind of scratching at the air with his mind powers. So the thumb kind of deviates from it to the side, almost like they're palming a basketball, even though there's no basketball there. Just drop in these scraggly little fingers. And I'll do a video later, too, regarding how to draw fingers and how to draw hands. I'll get more specific on that. I posted up the option on Facebook for what should I draw? Should I draw my secret for hands and feet? Which is it's a pretty slick little secret, but I got a lot of responses I really can't draw. So that definitely goes to show my type of friends. With friends like these, who needs the FCC censorship? I do, apparently. Now, whether this character in the background is female or not, I like the fluidity of their pose, as I mentioned before, because it does match someone of a powerful position, yet not a combat position, like a wizard who fights from a distance, or maybe a sneaky seductress, or an enchantress, or an enchanter, or warlock, some sort of evil person manipulating others. So it kind of suits the cause to have them sort of slinky like a snake, all serpentine and curving, as it reads through as more confidence rather than cowardness. It would be cowardly to just attack or control someone and manipulate them from a long distance. But it would come off as like a fake confidence to be like, and I can keep doing it and get away with it. Yeah, and almost kind of dancing and be gleeful while you're doing it. And I'm just throwing in and defining the hip box here, the leg as it would disappear, and giving a little bit of contrapposto where the other hip throws the other leg out. Because while that hip is down, then the leg comes out. So that although this character is hidden behind the foreground character, their posture should still read strong enough, regardless of how little of it is actually there. So there's barely anything there, and yet what's there should read stronger. I can even go so far as to tilt the head up and out if I wanted to, whereas in our reference, the head is more tilted down. I could still tilt the head down if I wanted to, match the line just like that. But the key focus being is that off-centered angle of the head gives it a bit more of a devious turn, as well as tipping it down, like someone who's gleefully enjoying that. So with most of the muscle structure laid in here, some of the pectorals as they leave the body, again, I'm not defining underneath the pectorals. Even if this was a woman, I would start to build off the breast tissue from here if I was to start bulking in the breast, because the pectorals are underneath it. And in the same way that you would build in the muscles for a guy and add the costume on top, any added features on top of a female structure should be the same thing. You would build up the muscle structure first, and then lay in all the extra stuff, be that extra defined hips, muscles, costume. So let's say if I wanted this character to be even more muscular, then I just start accentuating those curves more, even here in the deltoids, the bicep, forearms, neck muscles into the shoulders. And why not? Let's start throwing in some hair. Let's just... Now, some really good hair references. David Finch did a nice video series regarding how to draw hair. Take a look at his stuff. He brings a lot of body and a lot of volume to the way he draws hair in locks. And that's essentially where I draw my reference from, and that's essentially what I try to practice. So if you want to go right to the source, check out Dave Finch's videos. I think he's got a few of them on YouTube. But he's also got the I don't know if it's the Gnomon Workshop or something like that. It's like a GNON Mon Workshop, something along those lines. Alright, so that's our sketch for the day. And let me jump back to what our reference looked like. There's without her lines, there's without his lines, so that's the direct reference. Oh, that's me. There's what we were sketching. I'll try to line that up. There we go. Alright, so if you have any questions, feel free to add them to this. Message me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram, as well as YouTube here. So we are launching the BRINE's issue 3 live right now on Kickstarter. Hop over to Kickstarter right now and Google search for The BRINE by Lead-Based Studios. It's issue 3, and if you do support and back us high enough, you will get the back issues of 1 and 2. Feel free to spread the word. Share the video, share our Kickstarter page, and help us get the info out there. I'm really looking forward, really just to grow my audience. It's not about profit or anything like that. It's about growing my audience and entertaining people. The amount of work I've put into this book started from a 24-hour comic day idea that was pretty fast, and it was fairly manic. It was like a 1990s villain arrived, and I'm going to overthrow the king, and it was all over the place. But it was fun, and it was far from finished. I did not really complete the 24-hour comic day challenge, but I love being a part of that environment and getting that kind of studio feeling around other artists. But I was given a lot of positive feedback about how different that idea was, and I spent a lot of time focusing on a story and a plot, and I've got approximately 4 volumes worth of story plotted out. 1 volume's worth already written in script format, so that's 12 issues written in script already. 3 comics already done, so the first 3 issues are already done. 3 is just ready to go to print. We've had a lot of success selling issue 1 and 2. We had a lot of fan feedback. I've really been enjoying seeing a lot of people's reaction to the characters and to the artwork as well. So if you can, please support us on Kickstarter, support the BRINE, share it on your form of social media. This has been Nick Fights with Lead-Based Studios. Tune back in again. I'll do a video on my secret for drawing hands and feet. That's right, you'll be one step better than all 1990s comic book artists.